He told me I would rot in a nursing home. So I watched him drop me off and walk away without looking back. But life has a way of circling back. Months later, I was sitting in my wheelchair when I saw a janitor pushing a cart down the hallway. Head down, uniform stained, hands trembling. When he looked up, it was my son. The man who abandoned me was now scrubbing the very floors of the place he sent me to. And what happened next is something no mother is ever prepared for. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. He didn't shout it. That was the part that stunned me most. If he had yelled, slammed a door, cursed, I could have told myself it was heat-of-the-moment cruelty. Something spoken in a flare of anger. But he said it the way people say the weather will be cold tomorrow. Flat, certain, unquestioned. "You'll rot in a nursing home," he murmured, eyes still on his phone, thumb still scrolling, as if predicting my fate was nothing more than a passing thought. I remember the sound more than the words. The way the refrigerator hummed behind us. The faint tapping of rain against the kitchen window. The quiet. The kind that follows a truth you never expected to hear spoken out loud. I stood there holding a bowl I had cooked for him, still warm in my hands, my heart falling somewhere between my ribs and the floor. For the first time I saw him not as my son, the boy I raised, the toddler who once clung to my leg, the teenager whose laughter filled this house, but as a man I did not recognize. He didn't even look up. That was another part that hurt, though I didn't allow the tears to fall. I kept hearing his voice, but it didn't sound like him. It sounded older, sharper, like someone who had been rehearsing detachment for years. Maybe he had been. I placed the bowl on the table and sat down across from him. Not to argue, just to understand. He finally lifted his eyes when he sensed the weight of my silence. For a second, something flickered there, almost like guilt, almost like hesitation, but it vanished quickly. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as if preparing to defend himself from a crime he had not yet been accused of. "Mom, you can't expect me to take care of everything," he said, soft but cold. "I have a life, responsibilities, a family of my own." I nodded, though my chest tightened. I had never asked him to take care of everything. Only to care. Only to show up. Only to remember I existed beyond holidays and emergencies. Perhaps that, too, had become too heavy for him. I tried to respond, but nothing came. My throat felt thick, as if grief had taken physical form. He interpreted my silence as surrender, not sadness, and he returned to his phone with a relieved exhale. As if my heartbreak was simply a logistical detail resolved. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway, stopping for a moment to steady myself against the wall. The house felt colder, smaller, the air heavier with an invisible line drawn between us. I knew then, in a way I had never known before, that something precious had broken, not abruptly but quietly, the way ice cracks beneath your feet before you hear it. Later, alone in my room, I heard my own voice whispering the sentence he had spoken, as if repeating it might help me understand how we had reached this point. But the words offered no clarity, only truth. A truth I didn't want but could no longer ignore. He had spoken my future with the ease of someone who had already decided to leave me behind. And in that moment, the future I had imagined, the one where family carries one another through the hardest years, dissolved like dust in my hands. The house had always been full once. Full of footsteps running down the hallway, full of doors opening and closing, full of the familiar chaos that comes with raising children who believe the world is theirs for the taking. But now the room seemed to echo with the outlines of those memories, as if the walls themselves remembered more than my own children did. After they moved out, the silence settled in like dust, slowly at first, then in layers too thick to ignore. I would walk through the house in the mornings, touching the backs of chairs no one sat in anymore, smoothing the fabric on the couch as if preparing it for guests who would never come. Their bedrooms remained exactly as they had left them, frozen in time. A baseball glove on a shelf, a poster peeling off the wall, a perfume bottle with only a drop left inside. They had taken their futures with them but left behind fragments of the past, as if expecting me to hold on to everything they no longer needed. And for a long time I did. I dusted their trophies, watered the plants they'd planted and forgotten, washed the curtains they picked out as teenagers. I told myself it was what mothers did. Maintain the museum of childhood for as long as they could, even when no one visited the exhibits anymore. It wasn't until years later that I realized I hadn't been preserving memories. I had been preserving hope. Hope that one day they would walk through the front door again and say, "Mom, we missed you." Hope that the distance was temporary, that the silence was circumstantial, that I hadn't been left behind intentionally. That hope became thinner with time, but I clung to it the way some people cling to religion. Not because it made sense, but because it kept my heart from collapsing. The kitchen was the hardest room to be in. Every corner of it held echoes of conversations, of laughter, of small arguments that suddenly seemed precious now that they were gone. I would cook meals out of habit, forgetting halfway through that I was the only one who would be eating them. I set 2 plates on the table once without thinking. When I realized my mistake, I stared at the empty chair across from me until the food grew cold. The phone seldom rang, and when it did, it was never for long. Quick check-ins, surface-level questions, birthdays remembered through short texts, holidays spent elsewhere because their spouses' families had traditions that couldn't be broken. I became something they visited like a duty, not a person. A stop on their list of obligations. Sometimes I'd catch myself reaching for the living room light the way I used to when I stayed up waiting for them to come home. But now the light stayed off. There was no one to wait for. No footsteps approaching. Only the hum of appliances and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. The cruel truth was this. The house hadn't changed. People had. And somewhere along the way, without fanfare or farewell, I stopped being the center of their world and became a footnote in it. A soft chapter they no longer reread. A name stored in a phone instead of in their daily lives. It was then, in the quiet that pressed against my chest like a weight, that I understood something I had never dared to admit. A house without love is not a home, no matter how many memories remain stitched into the walls. It started with something small, or at least that's what I told myself. A simple misstep in the hallway. I had been carrying laundry from the dryer, the warm cotton pressed against my chest, when my foot caught the edge of the rug. The world tilted. There was no dramatic crash, no terrible scream. Just a quiet thud and the sharp sting of humiliation as I sat on the floor, stunned by how easily it had happened. For a long moment, I stayed there, listening to the house settle around me, trying to understand how a body that had carried children, lifted furniture, and worked through decades of life could suddenly betray me so easily. I managed to get up, but the ache in my hip lingered, a reminder that age was becoming something I couldn't simply ignore. That evening, as the pain pulsed through my leg, I called my son. Not because I wanted to alarm him, but because I needed to hear a familiar voice. A voice that once belonged to a boy who would run to me with concern over the smallest scraped knee. He answered on the 3rd ring, his tone already impatient. I could hear voices in the background. A TV, laughter, plates clinking. He was at dinner, or a gathering, or something more important than a phone call from his mother. I told him what happened, keeping my voice light, not wanting to worry him. But instead of concern, his response felt like a scolding. "Mom, you have to be careful," he said with a sigh, as if I had inconvenienced him by getting older. "I can't keep dropping everything every time you trip over something." I hadn't asked him to drop anything. I hadn't asked him to come. But the irritation in his voice spread through me like a bruise. I hung up soon after, telling him I would be fine. The truth was I wasn't sure. The next morning, the pain sharpened until I could barely stand. I drove myself to the hospital, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The doctor said it was a hairline fracture, nothing too serious, but enough to slow me down, enough to change things. He talked about mobility risks, about needing help, about fall precautions. Words that made me feel smaller with each syllable. When I called my son again, not for help, just to update him, I heard the same impatience, only heavier now. "You really need to think about long-term solutions," he said. "You can't live alone forever." This is becoming too much. Becoming too much. I replayed those words long after the call ended. Not, "Are you in pain?" Not, "Do you need anything?" Just the quiet admission that my existence had become a logistical problem for him to solve. Over the next weeks, moving around the house became a slow, cautious process. The fracture healed, but something else did not. Each time I reached for a handrail, each time I felt the tug of age in my bones, the memory of his irritation resurfaced. And for the first time, I saw clearly what I had refused to see before. My illness didn't open his heart. It closed it further. What should have brought us closer only revealed the distance he had already put between us. A distance that would only grow in the months ahead. I wasn't supposed to hear them. Or maybe they didn't care whether I did. The walls in my house were thin. They always had been. And their voices traveled down the hallway with a clarity that felt intentional. I sat on the edge of my bed, folding a sweater that didn't need folding, pretending I wasn't listening. But every word reached me with the precision of a blade. "She can't stay here anymore," my daughter-in-law said first. Her tone held no malice, only efficiency, like she was coordinating a delivery rather than discussing the fate of a living, breathing person. My son sighed, that same tired sigh he reserved for inconvenience. "I know. But the assisted living places are expensive. I looked up a few already. The decent ones cost a fortune." There was a pause. Papers rustled. I pictured them sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I had served them countless dinners, celebrated birthdays, mended arguments, raised them into adulthood. Now it was covered in brochures and numbers, cold figures dictating what my life was worth. "Well," she replied, "she doesn't need luxury. She needs care. Basic care. She won't even know the difference." I felt my chest tighten as the sweater slipped from my hands. I would know the difference. Course I would. I knew the difference between love and obligation, between being wanted and being tolerated. I had always known. My son cleared his throat. "There's a place on Brookside. Cheapest one around. Not great reviews, but it's reasonable." He lowered his voice, but not enough. "It's not like she's going to be there long-term if her health worsens." If her health worsens. The implication hung heavy in the air, as if my possible decline was nothing more than a financial timeline. My daughter-in-law clicked her tongue. "We can't let this drag on. I'm stressed enough with the kids, and your work schedule is insane. She needs professionals, not us running around." Not us. That was the part that burned. Once upon a time, us had meant family, support, sacrifice. Now it was a contractual agreement with an escape clause. "She won't like it," my son murmured, almost to himself. "She doesn't have to like it," she replied. "She just has to go." Their voices grew softer then, not from guilt but from calculation, arranging transport, paperwork, logistics. Everything except asking me what I wanted. Everything except remembering the woman who held them through fevers, scraped knees, heartbreak, and late-night terrors. The woman who worked double shifts so he could have name-brand shoes. The woman who skipped meals to send him on school trips he never thanked her for. I stared at the faded photograph on my dresser, a younger version of him with his arms around my neck, smiling as though he belonged nowhere else. I pressed my fingertips to the glass, tracing the outline of a boy who once trusted me, needed me, loved me without hesitation. Somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared. When they finished their discussion, chairs scraped, footsteps approached the hallway, and I quickly wiped my eyes. I straightened my posture, pretending I hadn't been listening to the slow dismantling of my future. My son knocked lightly on my door. "Mom, can we talk?" But the conversation that mattered had already happened, and I wasn't even in the room. The ride there was quiet. Too quiet. My son kept his eyes on the road. His jaw clenched in that familiar way that meant he wanted the conversation to end before it even began. My daughter-in-law sat beside him, scrolling through her phone as if this were an errand she needed to check off a list. I stared out the window, watching the scenery shift from familiar streets to the outskirts of town where the buildings grew older, smaller, forgotten. Felt like foreshadowing. When we pulled into the parking lot, my stomach dropped. The place looked tired. Its beige paint faded from years of sunlight and neglect. A wooden sign leaned crookedly at the entrance, the letters chipped. I swallowed hard but said nothing. Saying something would have implied I had a choice. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and boiled vegetables. A television blared in the common room where a few residents sat in wheelchairs facing the screen but not really watching. A nurse walked by with a cart of medication cups, the wheels squeaking every few steps. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dangerous. It was worse, it was empty. My son walked ahead of me, speaking with a receptionist in a tone that suggested he was discussing a delivery, not admitting his mother into a place she would now call home. My daughter-in-law hovered behind him, tapping her foot impatiently. When the paperwork was ready, they guided me toward a narrow hallway lit by dim overhead lights. Each door was marked with a number, not a name. Lives reduced to digits. My room was near the end. Terrell. A single bed with stiff sheets, a dresser with scratches on its surface, and walls painted in a dull off-white that made the whole space feel colder. And the thing I noticed instantly: no windows, no sunlight, no view of the world. Just four walls holding in everything I suddenly feared. I turned to my son, hoping for something. A reassurance. A moment of humanity. A reason to believe this wasn't abandonment disguised as practicality. "Well," he said, clapping his hands lightly as though concluding a transaction, "they'll take good care of you. We'll come by when we can." When we can. I knew what that meant. I had heard it before: birthdays that passed without them. Holidays celebrated without me. Milestones I learned about through photos and not presents. He kissed my cheek quickly, the way you do out of obligation. My daughter-in-law gave a polite smile that never touched her eyes. Then they were gone. Just like that. Their footsteps faded down the hallway, and with them, the last illusion that I still mattered in the way mothers hope they always will. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the loneliness settle around me like a second skin. It was heavy, cold, unforgiving. A soft knock interrupted my spiraling thoughts. A young nurse peeked in, her smile warm and genuine, a kindness I hadn't felt in so long it startled me. "Hi there," she said gently. "Let's get you settled. Hey Marcus. If you need anything at all, just press that button on the wall and I'll come running." I nodded, unable to speak. His kindness felt almost foreign. And so, in that windowless room surrounded by strangers, it became clear. The only warmth I had left came from people who owed me nothing. Not from the son who shared my blood. Not from the daughter-in-law who shared my table. But from strangers who saw me not as a burden, but as a person. A simple, aching truth settled into my bones. Sometimes family leaves you behind, and sometimes strangers lift you up. Marcus was the first person in that place who spoke to me as if I were more than a chart clipped to a clipboard. Every morning he entered my room with a knock that was soft but respectful, as though he understood that even in a nursing home, dignity was something a person should never have to surrender. His uniform was always a little wrinkled, his sneakers slightly worn, but his smile was warm enough to soften the coldest corners of that fluorescent-lit hallway. He talked to me while he worked, not in the rushed, distracted way some staff did, but with genuine interest. He asked about my favorite books, the meals I used to cook, the garden I once tended with careful hands. He listened without glancing at the clock, as if my stories mattered. Sometimes he would pull up a chair and sit beside me during his 5-minute breaks, telling me about his classes at the community college, how he was saving up to become a registered nurse one day, how he worked double shifts so he could help his younger sister stay in school. I learned more about humanity in those conversations than I had in years of motherhood. One afternoon, while he adjusted the pillows behind my back, he sighed quietly. "Most people here don't get many visitors," he said. "Some don't get any at all." He didn't say it to make me feel better. He said it because it was the truth, a truth he had witnessed every day. I thought of the common room, of the residents staring out at nothing, of the empty chairs beside their wheelchairs, of the calendars taped to the walls with not a single date marked "visit." I thought of how many birthdays had passed for them without candles, how many holidays had come and gone quietly without the familiar weight of family at their side. Marcus must have seen something shift in my expression because he gave a small nod. People survive here because of each other, he said. Staff, volunteers. Strangers mostly. Not the ones they expected. It was a simple sentence, but it struck me deeper than anything my own son had said in months. Over the next days, I began noticing what Marcus meant. I watched him feed Mr. Davidson slowly, patiently, even though the old man never remembered his name. I watched him braid Miss Irene's hair every Friday because she said it helped her remember being young. I watched him kneel beside a woman who cried for a husband who had died 20 years earlier, letting her grieve as if the loss were fresh, because for her it was. Kindness wasn't a grand gesture in this place. It was a cup of water held to trembling lips. A blanket warmed in a dryer before being draped over thin shoulders. A hand squeezed to chase away the fear that comes in the middle of the night. One evening when I couldn't sleep, I found Marcus sitting with a resident who had no family at all. He held the elderly man's hand, speaking softly until the man drifted off. When he stepped out of the room, he looked surprised to see me awake. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "I didn't want to interrupt," I whispered. "You weren't interrupting," he said. "Around here, we all take turns being someone's family." I looked at him then, this young man who had no obligation to me, no shared bloodline, no history, and realized he cared more about my well-being than the child I had raised from birth. It wasn't a bitter thought. It was simply the truth. That night, lying in my narrow bed, I felt something shift inside me. A small, fragile understanding that love doesn't always come from where you plant it. Sometimes it grows in places you never expected. Sometimes the deepest compassion comes from people who owe you nothing. And in that quiet realization, the nursing home felt a little less cold. Days in the nursing home had a rhythm so steady it felt rehearsed, as if each hour were part of a script written long before I arrived. Breakfast came at 7:30 every morning, whether you were hungry or not. Eggs, toast, oatmeal. Everything lukewarm, everything bland, everything portioned into neat little compartments on plastic trays. At 9 o'clock, someone would appear with a tiny paper cup and a plastic glass of water. Pills rattled like beads inside the cup, and you swallowed them with the kind of obedience that doesn't come from trust, but from resignation. Before, I used to choose my days. I decided when to cook, when to garden, when to clean, when to rest. I moved through my home with the freedom of someone who belonged there. But here, my life had folded into predetermined blocks of time. Meals, medication, bathing, therapy, lights out, repeat. And somehow, without even noticing when it happened, the edges of my independence had been rounded off until I wasn't sure where my choices ended and routine began. The common room was always humming with noise, television shows playing too loudly, though no one truly watched. The screen was just something to fill the silence. Residents sat in rows, their wheelchairs positioned like chairs in a waiting room, their gazes unfocused. Some nodded off, some stared straight ahead. Some whispered to themselves, holding conversations with memories long gone. I often sat in the corner near the old lamp that flickered whenever someone plugged something into the wall. From there I could see everything. The residents waiting for someone to remember them, the staff moving from room to room as briskly as their shifts allowed, and the slow, quiet unraveling of dignity that happens when no one is paying attention. It wasn't anyone's fault, not really. It was the way places like this were designed. Efficiency over comfort. Routine over individuality. It was easier to care for dozens of people when everyone followed the same schedule. But ease for them meant erasure for us. I noticed it first in the way people addressed me. Honey. Sweetheart. Mama. Not my name. Not my identity. Just soft, generic words used to soothe and manage. A month earlier, I had been a woman with a home, a voice, a presence. But within these walls I became a room number, a chart, a set of needs. One afternoon, I asked if I could have my lunch in my room instead of the dining area. The nurse smiled kindly but shook her head. "We have to keep everyone on the same schedule," she said. And I nodded like a child being told bedtime wasn't negotiable. I told myself it didn't matter. That food tasted the same wherever you ate it. But deep down it did matter. It mattered because small freedoms are the last pieces of a life you can call your own. And losing them one by one felt like watching yourself disappear in real time. Sometimes in the late afternoons I would sit in the courtyard, one of the few places where the world felt open. The sky looked different out there. Larger. Honest. I would close my eyes and imagine my old garden, the roses I once tended, the sun-warmed soil beneath my fingertips. I imagined breathing without a schedule, living without supervision. Those moments kept me anchored. Marcus would find me sometimes and sit beside me without a word. It was enough. The silence between us was gentle, not lonely. It reminded me that even in a place where life had shrunk to a timetable and a handful of pills, connection could still exist, not in grand gestures but in quiet presence. Still, every night as I lay in my narrow bed listening to the hallway lights buzz, I felt the truth settle into my bones. Dignity is fragile. It does not vanish with an explosion but with repetition, with small, daily losses that feel harmless until suddenly nothing belongs to you anymore. And in that realization, I understood something painful and important. I hadn't just been placed in a nursing home. I had been placed on the sidelines of my own life, a spectator in a world that once moved because I did. The phone rang at lunchtime, the sound sharp against the muted clatter of utensils in the dining hall. I wasn't expecting anyone. Most days passed without a single call, and I had learned not to hope for surprises. But when the nurse's aide handed me the receiver and mouthed, "It's your son," something inside me tightened. A small spark of foolish hope flickered. Maybe he finally missed me, maybe he finally cared enough to ask how I was doing. But the moment he spoke, that spark died. "Mom, listen," he began, his voice clipped, rushed, the tone he used when he needed something, not when he wanted to talk. "I need you to sign a document. It's important. Really important." I waited for him to ask how I felt, how the doctors were treating me, whether I was adjusting or lonely or scared. But he didn't ask a single question about me. Not one. Only about the document. "What kind of document?" I asked quietly. There was a brief pause, one he tried to fill with a casual laugh. "Just a financial thing. Something with the house. The bank needs a signature. That's all." My heart sank. The house. The one I had worked decades to keep. The one he had grown up in. The one he barely visited before putting me here. The house he now spoke of as if it belonged to him. "I don't want to sign anything until I know what it is," I said, steadying my voice. He exhaled sharply, annoyed. "Mom, don't make this difficult. I'm trying to handle everything on my own, and you being stubborn isn't helping." There it was again. Me as the problem, me as the inconvenience, me as the barrier between him and what he wanted. "What is it exactly?" I repeated. His patience snapped. "Fine. It's for refinancing. I need the house in my name. It'll make things easier. I've been paying your bills, I've been handling everything." "That's not true," I said softly. "You haven't been paying anything." Silence. Heavy. Telling. Then his voice dropped into something colder, something that sounded like resentment sharpened into a blade. "I can't take care of you and deal with this stupid property at the same time. You're in a safe place. That should be enough." Safe place. As if safety replaced love. As if putting me here erased his responsibility. As if the cheapest nursing home he found online was a gift, not an exile. "I won't sign it," I said. My voice didn't shake this time. The anger on the other end was immediate. Of course you'd do this to me. After everything I've done, you still have to make things harder. You don't understand how stressful my life is. You don't understand how much you've put on me." And then the final blow, sharp, thoughtless, honest in the ugliest way. "You should be grateful I even found somewhere to put you." I closed my eyes, feeling the words land like stones in my chest. Not somewhere to care for me. Not somewhere to help me. Somewhere to put me. Like luggage. A waste. like an obligation he could finally set down. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. When the call ended, I sat there holding the quiet receiver, my hand trembling, not from age but from clarity. The truth had finally spoken through him, unfiltered. He hadn't placed me here for my safety or comfort. He had placed me here to unburden himself, to make room for the life he wanted without me. That day, something closed inside me. Not bitterness, not hatred, but a door I had kept open far too long, waiting for a version of him that no longer existed. The nursing home didn't feel colder after that call. It felt honest. The announcement came during breakfast, right after the aides had poured lukewarm coffee into our plastic mugs. The head nurse stood near the entrance of the dining hall, her clipboard tucked under her arm. Her voice raised just enough to cut through the steady hum of wheelchairs and clinking utensils. "We have a new member joining the janitorial staff today," she said. "Please make him feel welcome." She didn't give a name. Just that one sentence, spoken with the polite formality she used for every new staff member, whether they stayed a month or a day. But the moment she walked away, the whispers began. Whispering was the truest currency in this place. Information traveled faster in a nursing home than in any city square, passed between residents like folded notes in a classroom. "I heard he's young," someone muttered. "Someone down on his luck," another said. "Joined out of desperation," a woman near the window whispered, leaning in. "Not because he wanted the job. Because he needed it." That caught my attention. Not because new staff was unusual. Turnover was as common as the sound of medication carts rolling down the hallway, but because of the tone. Desperation was something we all understood too well. Most of us had arrived here because life had cornered us, not because we had chosen this as our final home. Hearing that someone else had been pushed by circumstance struck a chord I didn't expect. Throughout the morning, the staff buzzed in their own way, speaking in half sentences as they passed each other in the halls. I caught a glimpse of two aides whispering near the supply closet. One shook her head, the other raised her eyebrows. I heard the faint echo of words like laid off, lost everything, and no experience drifting from their lowered voices. Whatever story belonged to this new hire, it was already making rounds faster than he was. I found myself curious, a feeling I hadn't felt in a while. Most days here bled into one another, predictable as clockwork, but the idea of someone new arriving out of need rather than ambition fractured that monotony. I wondered who he was, what had pushed him here, what kind of life he had before sweeping these fading hallways. After lunch, the residents gathered in small groups in the common room. Some stared at the television, others dozed, but the murmurs continued. "He starts this afternoon," someone said. "They're giving him the lower wing," someone else added, referring to the older, more neglected part of the building where the plumbing groaned and the air always seemed colder. A part of me expected to feel nothing about this news. After all, people came and went constantly. But something about the tension in the staff's voices and the curiosity in the residents' eyes made me uneasy. New hires usually entered with smiles, fresh uniforms, and polite enthusiasm. But this one was rumored to arrive burdened. Late in the afternoon, while I sat in the courtyard with a blanket over my knees, Marcus joined me with a sigh, dropping into the seat beside mine. "You heard about the new guy?" he asked. He nodded. "Everyone seems to know something." Marcus leaned back, watching the trees sway in the breeze. "Yeah. Well, the story's not a happy one." He didn't say more, and I didn't push him. His silence told me enough. Whoever this person was, whatever brought him here, it wasn't triumph. It was consequence. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the walkway, I felt a strange tug inside me, a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and something else I couldn't yet name. I had no idea then that this new hire would become the center of a revelation that would shake the quiet routine of my days. Or that his desperation would soon collide with my own forgotten grief in a way that neither of us could escape. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach that morning, sharper than usual, as if someone had scrubbed too hard or too quickly. I was sitting in the common room, half listening to the chatter from a game show on the television, when I heard the squeak of a cart's wheels. It wasn't unusual. Janitors came through constantly, but something about the sound made me lift my head. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the air shifting, heavy with a tension I couldn't yet name. And then I saw him. My son. He was pushing a janitor's cart down the hall, his shoulders hunched, his head lowered so deeply it was as though he hoped to disappear into the tiled floor. His uniform hung loosely on him, dark blue, stiff, unfamiliar. The fabric made him look older, smaller, stripped of the confidence he once carried like armor. His hands were gloved, thick rubber reaching up to his wrists, and in his back pocket I saw a folded rag stained from use. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. He didn't see me. Not at first. He was too focused on avoiding eye contact with the residents who watched him pass, too concerned with the mop bucket sloshing beside him. I watched him wipe at his forehead with the back of his gloved hand, watched him exhale as if the weight of the entire building sat on his chest. I saw how his movements were stiff, uncertain, how humiliation clung to him like a second uniform. My son, who once strutted into boardrooms and laughed loudly at his own jokes, now moved like a man trying not to be noticed. Time slowed. I took in every detail with the kind of clarity only pain can sharpen. The dark circles under his eyes. The slight tremble in his hand as he rearranged the cleaning supplies. The way he kept his eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to look at the world around him. And the thing that hurt most, the way he seemed smaller than I'd ever seen him, swallowed by a job he clearly never imagined himself doing. The whispers I'd overheard made sense now. The desperation, the downfall, the quiet warnings exchanged between staff. I had imagined a stranger, a man whose misfortune didn't concern me. But instead, here was the child I once carried on my hip, now pushing a cart that rattled with bottles and brushes. He passed my chair without looking up. I watched the top of his head move slowly across the room, watched the cart wheels bump over a ridge in the tile. Only when he reached the end of the hallway did he finally glance up, and that was when he froze. His eyes found mine. Shock washed over his face so quickly that his jaw dropped. The cart stopped moving. The rag slipped from his hand and fell to the floor with a soft thud. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. I didn't speak. He didn't speak. But the entire world seemed to press its weight between us, thick with everything unsaid. I didn't feel triumph. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Only a deep, aching sorrow. Because in that moment, I saw the truth not just of his humiliation, but of his humanity. How fragile it was, how easily it cracked. And beneath it all, I saw the little boy he used to be, the one who ran to me for comfort, now standing in a uniform meant for someone trying to rebuild a life that had collapsed. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. His eyes glistened, not from tears he allowed himself to shed, but from the ones he fought to hold back. And I knew, with painful clarity, that both of our lives had changed forever in that single quiet moment where he was no longer the son who sent me away. He was the man who had nowhere left to go. I didn't ask immediately. Shock has a way of sealing the mouth while the mind tries to rearrange the pieces of a story that suddenly looks nothing like what you believed. For hours after seeing him, I sat in my room, staring at the wall, replaying the image of him in that uniform. My son, who once insisted he was too busy for me, too important to be burdened by a mother aging, was now wiping floors in the place he had left me to fade quietly. The truth burned behind my ribs, but I didn't know its shape yet. That changed later that evening when one of the housekeepers, a woman named Marlene, knocked gently on my door. She was quiet by nature, one of those people who moved like a soft draft through the halls, cleaning, replenishing supplies, never inserting herself in anything more than necessary. That's why her presence startled me. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a careful hand. "You saw him today," she said softly. It wasn't a question. It was acknowledgement. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. She hesitated, then sat down on the chair beside my bed, wiping her palms on her apron. "I don't want to meddle," she said. But I thought maybe you deserved to know how he ended up here." A long silence stretched between us before she continued. "He had a business," she said. "A decent one. Something with distribution or contracting, I don't know the details. But it went under fast. Faster than anyone expected. Some bad investments, some debts piling up. Rumors say he tried to save it, but the banks didn't buy whatever promises he gave them." She paused, watching my face as if afraid of hurting me further. "He lost the house, cars, everything." I felt something twist inside me, an emotion I couldn't name. Not quite sympathy, not quite anger, something in between. Marlene went on, her voice low. "He tried applying everywhere. Offices, warehouses. No one was hiring. The only place that called him back," she gestured vaguely toward the hallway, "was here. Janitorial position. Minimum wage. Night shift. They say he broke down during the interview when he realized what the job was." My heart clenched. I imagined him sitting there, hearing the name of the very place he had sent me without hesitation, realizing that fate had swung him in a circle so sharp it cut. "He didn't want to take it," Marlene continued. "But when you're drowning in debt, when you've got rent overdue and no one left to help you," she gave a small shrug, "pride doesn't keep the lights on." I swallowed hard, the room blurring slightly. All the anger I had carried began to bend under the weight of a colder truth. Life had humbled him in ways I couldn't have imagined. Marlene touched my hand lightly. "He's not a bad man. Just a man who didn't think the world would ever turn on him. People like that fall the hardest." When she left, the silence in my room felt different. Not empty, but heavy with revelations I hadn't asked for. My son had put me here because he thought he'd never need me again. And now, in the cruel symmetry of life, he walked the same halls every day. Unseen, exhausted, swallowed by consequences he once believed he was above. For the first time since he abandoned me, I didn't feel invisible. But I did feel something else just as powerful. I felt the sharp sting of knowing the world had punished him in ways I never could have. I began seeing him more often after that day. Not because he sought me out, but because the nature of his work made it impossible to avoid the residence for long. The janitorial staff moved through every hallway, every bathroom, every forgotten corner of the building. And when he pushed that cart past my door or down the corridor, he always carried himself the same way. Head lowered, shoulders folded inward, steps small and tired. As if shrinking might make him invisible. One afternoon, I sat in my wheelchair outside the dining hall, waiting for Marcus to finish his shift. The smell of disinfectant drifted toward me before I saw him, a sharp, almost metallic scent that made the air feel colder. Then he appeared at the end of the hallway, carrying a mop and a bucket. His gloves pulled tight around fingers that looked far more worn than they had months earlier. He walked into the restroom and left the door open for ventilation. I could see him clearly from where I sat. I watched him kneel beside a toilet, scrubbing the inside of the bowl with movements that were slow and heavy, as though every swipe cost him something. His back was bent, his breath visible in the slight heave of his shoulders. He paused at one point, leaning against the stall wall, his eyes closing as if the exhaustion weighed more than the job itself. My son, who once criticized employees for not working hard enough, now scrubbed stains from the tile grout. My son, who once said I'd be better off in a place that could handle me, now cleaned the bathrooms of that same place, knowing that somewhere down the hall, his mother lived in a room without windows. He didn't know I was watching. Or maybe he did and couldn't bring himself to face me. He kept his focus fixed downward, refusing to look in my direction even when other residents shuffled past me with their walkers. Every few minutes, he swiped his forearm across his forehead, as if trying to push away more than just sweat. I could see the shame clinging to him like a shadow. It lingered in the stiffness of his movements, in the way he avoided eye contact with anyone, staff or resident. Even the younger aides, who chatted freely with each other, fell quiet when passing him. Pity softened their eyes. They knew. They all knew. At one moment, he reached for the bucket and knocked it slightly, sending water sloshing onto the floor. It spread in a thin sheet that reflected the overhead lights. He flinched, startled by the noise, and then quickly crouched down to wipe it up with a towel. His hands moved with frantic urgency, as if failure would cost him something he could no longer afford to lose. Watching him, I felt something complicated twist inside me. Not triumph, not vengeance, something stranger. I realized that life was teaching him a lesson I never could. Not through anger, not through arguments, but through the quiet, relentless consequences of his own choices. He had once chosen this place for me without hesitation. Now he scrubbed its floors. He rose to his feet at last, his expression tight. His eyes still focused anywhere but on me. I could see the dull red marks on his skin where the gloves had pressed too hard. I could see the slump of someone carrying a kind of humiliation that seeped beneath the surface. As he pushed the cart out of the restroom, our eyes nearly met. Almost. He looked up just long enough for his gaze to brush mine before he dropped it again, quickly, as if the truth between us burned too brightly to hold. And I understood then that what he carried wasn't only shame. It was the weight of realizing he now lived in the consequences of a decision he once made with ease. He had consigned me to this place believing it would remove his burdens. Now the place itself had become his burden. And all I could do was watch as the son who once walked through life with such certainty now moved like a man trying to clean away the pieces of himself he wished he hadn't broken. He noticed me on a day when he wasn't ready to face anything, not even himself. I was sitting near the end of the hallway in my wheelchair, waiting for Marcus to bring me an extra blanket because the air conditioner had decided to roar like winter again. My son came around the corner, pushing his cart slowly, lost in whatever thoughts a fallen man tries not to think. His head was down like always, eyes fixed on the wheels, on the floor, on anything that meant he didn't have to acknowledge the life he was living now. But the moment he lifted his gaze, even just slightly, the truth hit him like a physical force. He froze. The cart's wheels stopped with a soft squeak. His hands tightened around the handle. His chest rose too quickly, as if the air itself had become too heavy to pull into his lungs. His face went completely still, shock carved into every line. No words, not even a whisper. Just the raw, unguarded instinct of a man who suddenly stands face to face with the consequence he tried so hard to outrun. He didn't speak. His mouth opened, then closed again, as though the apology forming there couldn't find its way through years of pride. His eyes, tired red around the edges, blinked hard, and for a moment I thought he might fall to his knees. Shame has a way of buckling a person like that. It drains the strength long before tears appear. I didn't look away. I didn't soften my face to make it easier for him. I simply held his gaze with the quiet steadiness of someone who had already survived the worst part. I didn't feel anger in that moment, just a deep, aching clarity. He had spent months avoiding this very moment, turning corners before reaching my hallway, timing his shifts to miss the dining room rush, ducking into storage closets when he saw my wheelchair crossing the corridor. But reality has a way of finding you when you least expect it. For a long stretch of seconds, neither of us moved. The residents at the far tables murmured over their puzzle books, unaware. The television in the common room buzzed faintly with commercials. The building's old pipes clicked behind the walls. And we stayed there, mother and son, connected not by love this time, but by the heavy silence that hovered in the space between us. He tried again to form words. A weak breath escaped him. "Mom," he whispered, but the rest didn't come. It was as if his voice cracked under the weight of everything he had never said. Every dismissal, every selfish choice, every moment he had looked at me with inconvenience instead of affection. I could have spoken then. I could have demanded explanations or apologies, or reasons he would never be able to defend. I could have said all the things I spoke into my pillow on lonely nights in this place. But I didn't. I didn't need to. He already knew. Everything he needed to understand was written on his own face, in the tremor of his jaw, in the collapse of his pride, in the shame that traveled through him like a cold wind. I watched the man who once told me I'd rot in a nursing home stand in the very place he condemned me to, wearing the uniform of someone whose life had narrowed down to survival. And something inside him finally crumbled. He lowered his head, not out of defeat, but out of recognition. Recognition that the person he had abandoned was still here, still alive, still watching, still waiting for him to face himself. And he did, not with words, but with the silent collapse of everything he once hid behind. For once, silence didn't hurt. It revealed the truth more loudly than any apology ever could. He never said the words. Not at first. Not "I'm sorry," not "I was wrong," not even "I shouldn't have done this to you." But something shifted after the day he froze in front of me. The day pride finally cracked open and let truth spill through. It didn't happen in an explosion of emotion. It happened quietly, almost timidly, like someone learning to walk again after forgetting how. The first change came during dinner. A tray appeared in my room, hot for once, not lukewarm. The mashed potatoes still held their steam, and the vegetables hadn't turned soft from sitting under heat lamps. Marcus wasn't the one who brought it. When I asked him later, he simply smiled and nodded toward the far hallway. He insisted, he said. My son didn't knock or wait to be thanked. He left the tray on my table and slipped away before I could catch him. But I noticed the small details. The way he'd placed the napkin neatly beside the plate, the way he'd double-checked that the silverware wasn't bent, the way he'd added a packet of sugar for my tea because he remembered, after all this time, how I liked it. Over the next few days, the gestures multiplied quietly. A loose screw in my dresser drawer suddenly tightened. A flickering light bulb replaced before I called maintenance. A blanket folded at the foot of my bed, the soft one I always asked for. None of it was grand. None of it was loud. But every action carried the weight of the words he was too ashamed to speak. I watched him move through the hallways with a different posture. Not the defeated slump I had seen before, but something steadier. He'd stop by my doorway, standing just outside the frame, as if afraid to enter without permission. Sometimes he'd ask if I needed my pillows fluffed or if the thermostat was too low. Sometimes he'd clean the windowsill even though it wasn't dirty. And sometimes he'd just stand there, pretending to check his work schedule pinned near the door, waiting for me to acknowledge him. I didn't make it easy. Not out of cruelty, but because truth requires time, and trust requires proof. The real shift came the night a storm rolled in. Lightning cracked against the sky, shaking the building in waves. Many residents grew anxious during storms, and the night staff was short-handed. That evening, when most of the employees rushed from room to room, calming nerves and closing blinds, I found my son sitting in the chair beside my bed. He wasn't on shift. He had finished hours earlier. Yet there he was, still in his uniform, the fabric damp with sweat. His hair slightly flattened from the humidity. He didn't say why he stayed. He didn't need to. He sat through the thunder without touching his phone, without checking the time, without looking restless. He sat like someone who finally understood the meaning of presence. Every few minutes, he glanced at me, not to watch over me like a duty but to make sure I wasn't frightened. When the wind rattled the window, he stood and checked the latch. When I shifted in bed, he adjusted the blanket with gentle hands, the same hands that once pushed me away without thought. When I closed my eyes, he whispered, "I'll stay until the storm passes." Still no apology. But actions have a language of their own. Over the next week, he began covering extra shifts, night shifts, morning shifts, anything that kept him near. The staff noticed, but no one questioned it. He mopped floors with more focus. He changed trash bags with more care. He looked at the residents the way he never looked at me before. With patience, with compassion, with a quiet sorrow that comes from recognizing one's own failures reflected in the suffering of others. And then one evening, when he brought my dinner tray again, he lingered a few seconds longer than usual. His hands shook. His voice broke slightly when he said, "Do you need anything else?" It wasn't the right question, not the one he meant. But I heard the truth beneath it. Do you need anything from me? Do you need anything to heal? Do you need anything, so I can make this right? I didn't answer. Instead, I simply looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, I saw not the son who abandoned me, but the man trying piece by piece to come back. Peace didn't arrive suddenly. It didn't sweep in like a revelation or a miracle or one of those dramatic moments people talk about in stories. It came the way dawn comes, slowly, quietly, softly lightening the edges of a long night until you realize the darkness isn't as heavy as it once was. It settled into me after days spent watching my son move through the hallways with an almost fragile determination, after nights when he sat beside me without asking for anything in return, after countless small moments when his actions, hesitant, clumsy, sincere, spoke the apology he still couldn't bring himself to say aloud. I found myself thinking often about the beginning. About the day he told me I would rot in a nursing home. About the way I carried that sentence like a stone in my chest for months. About the loneliness, the betrayal, the bitter truth that he had left me here without a second thought, convinced I was nothing more than a burden he needed to set down. And yet, here he was now, mopping these floors, pushing that cart, showing up every day for people he had never met, and for me, quietly, consistently, painfully aware of what he had done. Forgiveness came quietly, too. Not as a favor to him. Not as an erasure of everything I endured. Not as a rewriting of the past. But because I finally understood something I had resisted for so long. Holding on to the weight of his cruelty didn't protect me. It imprisoned me. And watching him now, eyes tired, steps careful, pride cracked open, I realized that life had punished him far more deeply than my anger ever could. One afternoon, he entered my room after finishing his shift. His uniform was damp with sweat, his hands still gloved, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked at me the way a child looks at a doorway they're afraid to walk through, hoping to be allowed inside, afraid they'll be turned away. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He just stood there, the air heavy with everything unspoken. I reached for the corner of the blanket and smoothed it gently, giving myself a moment before meeting his eyes. They shimmered not with tears, but with remorse so deep it softened every part of him. "I'm not angry anymore," I said softly. His mouth trembled. His breath hitched. And though he didn't step closer, something inside him collapsed in relief, like a man allowed to exhale after holding his breath for years. But forgiveness wasn't really about him. It was about reclaiming myself. He would live with his choices. He would live with the memory of what he did. And he would live with the moment he realized that the woman he dismissed, the mother he abandoned, still found enough strength to choose peace over bitterness. In the days that followed, something settled between us. Not reconciliation, not restoration, but understanding. A fragile bridge built not on words, but on truth. He served dinner. He replaced my broken lamp. He sat with me on quiet evenings when the hallways dimmed and the television hummed softly. And I allowed myself to let go, not of memory, but of resentment. Because peace isn't forgetting. It's no longer being held hostage by what hurt you. The final scene unfolded one evening as the sun dipped behind the courtyard beyond the nursing home. I sat by the window, watching the sky bleed into soft oranges and pinks. My son stood outside, emptying a trash bin, the glow of the sunset catching the edges of his face. He paused for a second, lifted his gaze toward my window, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. A small, humble smile. A smile without pride. Without pretense. Without the armor he once lived behind. I nodded back just once. And I felt it fully, honestly, quietly. Some lessons arrive too late to repair the past, but just in time to change what remains of the future. Peace at last was mine.